Well, thank you both for being here. Treasurer Russell, Senator McKinney. As a recovering politician myself, I understand your desire not to want to return to the Senate. Yeah. So.
I know, I see a lot of familiar faces. I'm like, what are you guys doing? It's great when you're out. Trust me.
Well, thank you both for being here and talking about a critical issue for the state of Connecticut, which is the pension debt and pension reform and ultimately the investment returns that come on that pension investment that we have. So I'll start with you, Treasurer Russell. You know, you just marked about a year in office,
yep.
A couple weeks into your second year in office. And the question for you would be, you know, what are some of the major highlights that you've had over this first year? It's been a busy one in your office, as I understand.
It has been. And first, just want to say thank you for having me here today and convening this conversation. It's always great to talk about the work we're doing. I think Treasurer's Office is one that has not gotten much attention in terms of the importance of the work, and so it's always great to be able to talk about what we're doing. First, I'm really enjoying the job. I was familiar with it. I actually represented the Treasurer's Office in my prior role in private practice, and it's really just great working with a lot of dedicated public servants who, frankly, could be doing a host of different things. Most have come from the private sector, particularly on the investment side, and are committed to the work that they're doing, and so it's been really rewarding. There's a lot that we've gotten done in a year. I can't believe the year's flown by as quickly as it has. I would say the top pieces would be, one is just our overall commitment to fiscal health as a state. We heard the governor talk about this on many fronts, but the real bipartisan commitment and culture that's been developed around addressing some of the longstanding issues that we've had that we've kind of kicked down the road for many years. We are finally in a spot where we are fully funding our pensions. We're making these additional contributions. We have a full rainy day fund. We're set up to withstand volatility or a downturn in the market. And we've seen the impact of this. My office manages all of our credit rating relationships with rating agencies. We've seen several upgrades there, which are allowing us to continue to invest in our communities, in the state, at the lowest cost to taxpayers. And so I'm proud of that commitment for us as a state. Two, what I would say are investment performance, but really the strides that we're making for long-term performance. We performed at 8.5% this last fiscal year. We were recognized by the Pensions and Investments publication for being the largest outperformer of our benchmark. But I think more importantly, a lot of the measures that we're putting in place are setting us up for long-term sustained investment performance. And then third, I would say baby bonds. This was a big initiative. It was a first-in-the-nation program where we are investing directly in people. So for every child whose birth is covered by Medicaid now in Connecticut, there will be $3,200 invested in a trust on their behalf that's managed by my office, and that money will grow over the life of that child. And when they're between the ages of 18 and 30, they can access those resources for wealth-building opportunities, like purchasing a home here in Connecticut, starting or investing in a Connecticut business, helping to pay for post-secondary education or job training. And what it's really about, in addition to kind of the social benefit, is it's going to have a huge economic benefit. The program is structured so that all of these resources will be reinvested right here in Connecticut. We'll be building a stronger, more educated workforce. And so, you know, I'm really proud of the way we were able to do that in collaboration with the governor and the legislature, and really kind of leading the way across the country.
And you just marked about the 6-month mark for that baby bonds program, and had about almost 8,000 Connecticut residents born into the program, and it's in nearly every town, correct?
That's correct. So far, at the 6-month mark, there are 164 towns that have had at least one child born eligible for the program. And this is what we talked about, right? It's a poverty addressing program. We have poverty throughout the state, and it really is about creating opportunities for people to be able to lift themselves up in a meaningful way. And so we're excited about the kind of long-term prospect here, and are really appreciative of the folks who stepped up. And, you know, there's a lot of political courage involved in making an investment like this that isn't going to fully bear fruit until 18 plus years down the road, when I and many of the other folks that are in elected office will no longer be here. But it's really a testament, I think, to the state leading the way.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, to get lawmakers, policymakers to make decisions that don't necessarily impact the next year, the next budget, or even the next election cycle, but looking into the future and thinking about what's really to come is really important. And another thing that came up in your first year was a report by Yale University that talked about the pension investment funds, and was the first time really ever that any kind of real research group looked at all 50 states and kind of compared those investment returns. And unfortunately, Connecticut kind of ranked near the bottom, right? We looked at it as possibly leaving $27 billion on the table if we had invested at the median that some of these other states had invested at. But that report was very important to point out that in your first year in office, you've made a lot of changes there. And I'll quote that you are now smartly being, a lot of those issues are now smartly being unwound by the current leadership. And that's you. Let's talk about some of those changes that you're making to kind of increase those investment returns for the pension fund.
Sure, and I appreciate you bringing it up. I think what is really important about the study, not only in showing opportunity for us to kind of improve performance, but also just bringing attention to this work and the importance of investment returns and the impact it has for pensioners and for taxpayers across the state. We came in fully aware of some of these challenges, not necessarily looking at it from a historical perspective, but looking at opportunity moving forward. And so we hit the ground running. The biggest piece, we did a strategic asset allocation study and have a new asset allocation, which asset allocation accounts for over 90% of your performance as a public pension fund. It's essentially how much of your portfolio is invested in each asset class. We have a global diversified portfolio, so it's what percentage of your portfolio is in, whether it's private equity or public equities or private credit or real assets. And so we put that new asset allocation in place. We've been working to right-size the portfolio to align with that. It's also kind of our risk-reward profile, right? It's how much risk are you willing to take on to meet your target return of investment over a market cycle. And so we've been wanting to do this very methodically. We are increasing our allocations toward private markets. And when you're doing that, you obviously don't want to do that overnight. So we have a 5-year pacing plan that we are working at, kind of hitting targets to align with that new asset allocation. So that was one big piece. And we worked very closely with our investment advisory council, with an outside consultant in kind of putting that together. The second would be legislation. So one of our first pieces of legislation was to strengthen the investment advisory council. We first should probably start by explaining what the investment advisory council is. But the investment advisory council is essentially our oversight board. We work very closely together. It is made up, the chair of the IAC is appointed by the governor. There are members from the teachers and state employees unions, and then leadership from the House and Senate from both sides of the aisle each have appointments to the IAC. And so they are responsible for setting our asset allocation and investment policy statement, are really involved in kind of high-level investment strategy. And so this new legislation was really aimed at making sure we can attract and have appointed the best investment talent that we can get. We obviously have a host of talent here in Connecticut, but the way that statutes were set up historically is that it essentially prevented anyone who's in the investment or financial industry from actually serving on the IAC for concerns around conflicts. And so we were able to change that legislation with the goal of really strengthening the IAC, and we have some incredible talent on the IAC. And then the second piece of that legislation was around recruitment and retention. So a bill to make sure that we can attract and retain top-tier investment talent, that we could be competitive in the market from a compensation standpoint, and that we could also kind of build out ladders within the organization so people could work their way up. So that was another piece. I think just the overall culture is very important. As I mentioned, we have some incredibly dedicated public servants that are doing this work because they care about the state, because they care about the future of our pensioners. And so really wanting to establish a culture of investment excellence, but also where people feel proud of the work that they're doing. And so there's we have a whole, in terms of reviewing managers, we've done a lot of that work. We've been streamlining, so eliminating managers that are not meeting our expectations from a performance standpoint. We obviously are tracking that regularly, but the larger goal here is to reduce the number of managers that we have overall. I think we've been a little over-diversified on that front, and we're really scaling up with managers we have high conviction in. And the benefit to that is also that we're lowering fees. As we scale up with strong managers, we're able to get a better kind of economic piece to that. Lastly, I would say is just being more efficient. So we are, again, streamlining in areas that we've been able to eliminate managers and index or have more passive investments. We've been doing that, which again is lowering costs and fees. And so, we're doing a lot of work in this first year. There's obviously still plenty of work to do, but I think what's great is that we're starting to see many of these changes that we're putting in place actually have a positive benefit on returns already.
Yeah, and to your point that looking at it as a long-term look, but just in this first year, your benchmark is 6.9% return, and you hit 8.5% after some of these changes that you've made. So it's been great work in your first year.
Thank you. And I would say, to put that in perspective, I mean, we were performed in the top 25% of public pension funds across the country. I think that's a good indicator, right? At times we could be the top performing pension fund and we could be at a 3% return. Mm-hmm. And so our 6.9 target is not on an annual cycle, right? It's over a market cycle. And as long-term investors, that's really what our focus is. Yeah.
And now, Senator McKinney, I know you spent a lot of time when you were in the Senate working on the unfunded pension liability issue that Connecticut has, and we've made some strides. The comptroller just came out with a report looking at that we're about 51% funded now, which is a great change from when your time in the Senate, when we were, I think, in the high 70s of underfunding that program. But we still face a big challenge. We're about $60 billion underfunded. Talk about some of the things that you did in your time in the Senate and some of the things that we can look to change in the future.
Right. Well, thank you, Chris. It's great to be here. And I just to start off, if you were looking for a Washington-type partisan battle here, you're not going to get it. Eric is a good friend of mine, and I really appreciate the job he's been doing and the reforms he's brought in. I was first elected in 1998, and to be honest, I was less than successful on trying to get people to focus on our pension debt. And it really wasn't until the fiscal guardrails and the bipartisan budget was put in 2017 where Connecticut said, we are going to take money and we're going to pay down our debt. When I was in the legislature, we did things like this. If the market performed so well and above the level that we had anticipated, we would put less into the pension payments because the market, overperformance balanced us off so we could say, well, we're giving our actuarial amount. Now, what were you going to do when the market underperformed? Did we make up for that? No, we didn't. And that went on for decades, and that's why we have the problem. I always try to explain to people, the governor talked about the budget. He said, look, we have a good budget. It's balanced. A lot of other states are seeing deficits now. We're not, in large part, because of those guardrails. It's an election year. 187 legislators are up for re-election. No one's going to want to run for re-election and say, hey, we passed the budget 2 years ago. It's great. We're not going to make any changes. That's just not the nature of what politics is in this day. They want to say something new and shiny happened right before they're running. And so I always use the example of if you have something structurally wrong in your house, it's a big problem. It needs to be fixed. It's going to cost a lot of money. And the longer you go without addressing that problem, the worse it's going to be. But when you fix that problem, you're never going to see it. So if you're a politician, how do you sell that to your constituents? We spent all this money, billions of dollars, and you never get to see it. I'd rather repaint the house every 5 years and show you a shiny picture of the new paint color, because that's going to help me get reelected. So the guardrails have taken that away from the annual urge of politicians to spend and said, no, we're not going to do that. Putting $1 billion or billions of dollars, we were, I think, at 36% of our pension funding around 2016, 2017. We're now over 50%. We're still 48th in the country. The average is 78% nationally. So my message is we cannot change those guardrails until we get much closer to that average of 78%. And we are contractually obligated to make these pension payments to our retirees. There isn't any getting out of it in the future. And I think people think, well, maybe if we just don't have the money, we don't have to pay it. No, that's not the case. That's not the CBIA agreement. That's not what the contract is. So a lot more of what we've been doing over the last 3-4 years needs to continue to do. There's always going to be an urge to spend more money. There's always going to be a need that is not fully met in the state of Connecticut. And even if we were to see the legislature raise taxes, increase spending, go through the spending cap, there's still going to be people saying we haven't raised enough revenue because we still need to spend more money. So my message is not a sexy one for people running for election, but it's what we've been doing is working, and we need to continue doing it.
And you mentioned the CBIA agreement, and that comes up for expiration in just a few short years, I think 2027. And so people are already starting to think about, like, what does the future look like of that agreement and what kind of efficiencies can be found. The state of Connecticut, a couple of years ago under Governor Lamont, hired the Boston Consulting Group to take a look at finding efficiencies, and especially in overtime and digitizing Connecticut's government workforce. And what are your thoughts on that report that showed that you could have $70 to $100 million in savings annually if you just made a few of these changes?
Right. Well, Chris is talking about the CREATES report, which is 127 pages. Raise your hand if you read it. I mean, yeah, right? That CREATE report is sitting next to the Transportation Strategy Board report that Brian Flaherty and I know about from years ago. If you're going to write a 127-page report, nobody's going to read it. Sorry, just give me the summary. There's a lot of good stuff in there, though. And Connecticut, for a long time, has been far too slow to advance technology within our government. One of the things I do now, the governor appointed me as one of the state liquor commissioners. It just happened in January 2024 where anyone who wants a liquor permit or wants to deal with alcohol in the state of Connecticut can now do everything online. The fact that it took us to 2024 is crazy, but there are so many things that I see the staff at the Department of Consumer Protection used to do without this new online, work that they don't have to do now. So they will be much more efficient and streamlined in their work because we're using technology better in that one instance. That can be done system-wide in the state of Connecticut. The other thing, and this has been an issue for me going back since when I first ran, and it's a politically difficult issue, but I'm sure many of you out there have volunteered on charities or boards in your communities. We have tremendous nonprofit private providers in the state of Connecticut. We as a state of Connecticut also provide a lot of services to people in need. Our private nonprofit providers provide those services, I would argue, every bit as well, if not better than the state, for almost half the cost. And we just can't get over that political battle to release more of that work with the state helping the private nonprofits rather than the state doing it. It always frustrated me when the state would compete with private industry because we never leveled the playing field. We never lived by your hiring, employment, and other rules, and yet we said we're going to compete with you. I don't think it works financially, and I think that's probably the area where we can make the biggest savings. It's also the hardest one to achieve in a political environment.
Yeah, and part of it comes down to workforce, too. I mean, the state of Connecticut's been struggling in finding workers in their own departments and getting people to come back to work. And then even those private providers, we hear from them quite often that they're struggling in finding people. But all the businesses here today are dealing with that workforce shortage issue as well. And you had mentioned, Treasurer, that in your office you're making changes on who you're hiring and recruiting talent there. And if you could kind of touch upon the impact that that's had on your office.
Sure, it's been critical. The reality is if with a strong investment team, you're going to perform well, right? The legislation has been really important to make sure that we can be competitive from a salary perspective. Again, we're in a very competitive market, and what we found is that we were kind of below the median for compensation for investment professionals. And when you're in as competitive of a market as Connecticut is with New York and Boston and so many of these other folks, we're not looking to set the market, right? But we don't want to be in a spot where we're losing the investment talent that we want to other public pension funds. We obviously know that we can't compete with the private sector, and the folks who are in our office who have, again, come from Goldman and Carlyle and so many of the other, kind of big private investment shops are here because they are committed to the work. The creation of the latter piece is also important. So we were really rigid in our structure around investment professional kind of positions, right? So we had analysts, investment officers, principal investment officers, and then the deputy and CIO. Those are big jumps for anyone. So we would have, one of our folks who are in our office currently, she actually started as an intern. She's gone through and done a ton of school, and she's an analyst. She's a lot more experienced than an analyst, but there was no position or ladder for her to kind of move up to the next level. And so what this new legislation has done is created positions so that we can really retain that talent and develop people along the way as we're moving through the process. But, you know, we do have an incredible team. I think a lot of this is about continuity. We know that there is a strong correlation between continuity within your investment team, particularly at the CIO level, and performance. You can see it all across the country. We have had a lot of challenges with this historically. We went a 12-year window here where we had 10 CIOs. And we're not the only state. I mean, there's some states right now that you see this. It's every year plus the CIO is turning over. And as long-term investors, how do you set that long-term investment strategy and actually let it play out if there is this constant turnover at the top? What it also does is impact all of the rest of the team, right? Is if the CIO is turning over every year, your principal investment officers and folks below them are going to turn over consistently as well. And so we have a great team in place. We want to make sure that we continue to provide the support for the team that they need, understanding that keeping the right people in place over an extended period of time is really going to benefit pensioners and taxpayers in the state.
And Chris, if I could just add, this is one area, excuse me, where I actually would give the treasurer more latitude. You know, we're investing billions of dollars, and there's tremendous talent in the state of Connecticut. A CIO investing billions of dollars successfully is going to make a heck of a lot more money working for Goldman than they are for the state of Connecticut. We should actually be competing with them for that talent. We make those exceptions. You know, we're not paying Gino Auriemma, you know, $200,000 to be a state employee. We wouldn't have a women's basketball program. And that's just the reality. And people, you know, sometimes complain, well, you're a state school. Why are you paying somebody so much? Well, because we've made the decision that there's a return on investment. And there is a return on that investment. And that pales in comparison to investing billions of dollars. So I personally would say, you know, we should give the treasurer, working with the IAC, and I have some different thoughts about the IAC, but working with the IAC to bring in and salary should not be a bar to get the most talented people to invest tens of billions of dollars.
And to that point, the IAC, the Investment Advisory Council, you said you had some different thoughts on how that could be structured. And I know in your time in the state legislature, you attempted numerous bills to try to make that happen. You want to talk about that?
Well, I did. I came in 1999. I was sworn in, and one of the first bills we put in was to change the treasurer's office from a sole fiduciary to a co-fiduciary with a board of directors. I just didn't think, with all due respect to Eric, it's not about Eric, that any one person should be responsible for all of this money. When I became and the bill didn't go anywhere, and if you're not going to get buy-in from the treasurer's office and from the majority in the legislature, bills aren't going to go anywhere. When I became the Republican leader, I had an appointment to the IAC. I had to find a retired investment professional, which wasn't difficult. I represented towns in Fairfield County. And I found a gentleman who was very eager to do it. And after about a year and a half, he sent me a 12-page letter of resignation explaining why he resigned. And his examples all included when the council unanimously made recommendations to the treasurer's office and the treasurer did not accept them. Now, that's not how Eric is operating. I want to be clear. This is long before Eric. You know, you were probably in high school at the time. That became a frustration. One, I was limited in who I could find to appoint. Eric's fixed that with working with the legislature, which is a really good change. But two, you know, if you know the makeup of the IAC, the governor, legislative leaders have appointments who all have to be investment professionals, and they're also labor representatives, which should be there because they're representing the employees who it's their money. But the guy I appointed was a very conservative, fiscal, staunch type of person. And he was, you know, arm in arm with the labor leaders saying, here's some changes we need to make. And he was like, you wouldn't believe that we were getting along and agreeing on this, and then no one listened to us. So I think that's a structural problem that when we have a good treasurer isn't a problem, but not always the case. So again, I think the reforms have been good. I personally think we could go a little bit farther, but I think we're headed in a better direction now for sure.
Yeah, and to that point, in conversations with legislators from both sides of the aisle, that Yale report caught a lot of people's attention, right? And it was before your time and before these changes that you've made here, but it's gotten people thinking about, what is the structure of decisions being made in the Treasurer's office. And I know there has been some conversations to reform that IAC, maybe empower them a little bit more for making decisions along with you rather than just advising you. And just what some of your thoughts on some of those ideas that are floated out there. None of the bills have been introduced yet. But.
Yeah, sure. And I don't know the specifics of many of the things that have been proposed. I haven't seen
exactly
any of them yet, so I don't know exactly what that looks like. I would say first, I think there's some misconception about what the role of the IAC is, and I'm curious to know kind of the topics or specifics around what recommendations were being made.
A lot of it was around the IPS. And
okay. Because the IAC right now, right, they are not advisory when it comes to the investment policy statement. They have to adopt the investment policy statement. They're not advisory when it comes to our strategic asset allocation, which accounts for more than 90% of our performance. They have to adopt that and are involved in kind of the overarching investment strategy. What I would also say, just from a due diligence process, because I do think that when we talk about a principal fiduciary structure, there is a belief that I'm sitting behind my desk saying, all right, let's send $1 billion to X firm. We due diligence, so there's a RFP process for managers on the public side, where we essentially have a pool that and those RFPs and specifics are kind of focused on specific areas of our portfolio. And then on the private side, I mean, we due diligence managers for sometimes years, right? We could come across a great manager that doesn't fit with where we're going in our portfolio, and we keep an eye on them, and 3 years down the road, there's something that makes sense. But that starts with our analysts and investment officers, principal investment officers for a specific asset class. I'm involved as they kind of, in terms of just seeing where we're going, to if there are opportunities to kind of see those things in advance. And then the CIO is involved in all of that. Recommendations then come to me. I then meet with that manager, go through my own kind of process in asking questions and vetting them. And then we make a recommendation to the Investment Advisory Council, who then goes through their entire process, gets to ask questions, provide feedback, and then in that meeting ultimately votes on whether or not they are supportive or not of that investment. And all of this is public and out there, all of the materials. There also, for every manager that we're investing in, there is a outside general consultant, independent, that would do their own analysis of that manager and make a recommendation as to how much conviction they have in that investment. I say this because I think when these reports or things like this come up, there naturally is this interest in reacting and making a change. I think it's important to note that this report now dates back several years, right, and for performance from many years back, and that it doesn't account for many of the changes that have been made up to this point. And I think, the IAC has more teeth than people think, but even if you look at our 10-year return numbers now, we are above the median for performance, whereas in that study we were talked about as kind of being in the 98th percentile, which also means that there are half of the other public pension funds out there, most of whom have board structures that are underperforming us. If I thought that that was kind of the fix, I would be the first one to recommend it. I think part of this is that we are making incredible strides. We're performing well. A lot of the reforms that we were able to make in this short period of time would have taken us years if we actually had a board structure. Because for all of these too, it's political appointments and folks have their own interest in that as well. But I think my biggest concern is wanting to be an obstacle or throwing a wrench in the progress that we're making, which ultimately is not going to benefit pensioners and taxpayers in the state.
And let's talk about what those changes mean for the state, right? And when pension investments are up, that means essentially less money has to be allocated from the appropriated funds from like the general fund to meet those actuarial requirements that we have. And what that does is opens up some ability to spend more on and make investments, if you will, on housing, education, childcare. Senator McKinney, what are we looking at if we continue to make those deposits from the volatility cap into the pension fund? What are the opportunities that exist if we can continue to make those long-term investments that put additional money into that fund?
Well, I think the governor mentioned, we freed up $600 million in the budget because we're not having that go-to debt payment, because we've paid off our pension fund. There was a year when the economy was crashing, 2007, 2008, we had a huge budget deficit. There was a year where the legislature, this is why I only voted for 2 budgets in 16 years. There was a year the legislature borrowed money to pay the interest cost on the money we borrowed, rather than make tough decisions. I mean, I see people laughing. It's true. I mean, you don't even have to make up stories in politics. The truth is actually pretty funny sometimes. So obviously, the more we're going to pay down our debt, the more freedom we're going to have within our budget. But I think it's deeper than that. I mean, you guys, CBIA, over the course of my tenure there, had great representatives. You have terrific representatives now who would come up to the Capitol and talk, and I know it gets frustrating sometimes because you say the same thing, and people aren't necessarily, maybe they're listening, but they're not agreeing. But the one constant I think everybody knows in dealing with businesses, small or large, is you want stability and predictability. And even if it's bad news, tell me what that bad news is going to be, how long it's going to last, and stick to it. And so the biggest benefit of continuing the guardrails is that people will have that stability and predictability. We went from, the governor said, boom to bust. We had years where we had billion-dollar deficits and billion-dollar surpluses. We need to smooth those out. That's what the guardrails do. That gives you the predictability and stability, because most of you out there aren't planning 3 months, the next election. You're planning for a lot longer horizon. And the guardrails provide that long-term planning that is not natural to politicians running for election every 2 years.
I would just say, too, because I think this is an important point around, we talk about our pension debt and we talk about performance. The reality is that we didn't get here because of pension fund performance. We are in this spot because we went 70 years without properly funding our pensions. And we're not going to dig ourselves out of this hole through pension fund performance either. This commitment, and again, which has happened on a bipartisan basis, I think as a state, there's been this culture now of doing what we're supposed to do and not kicking the can down the road or passing obligations down on to future generations like has been done in the past. It's going to take some time, but there is this steady commitment to making sure that we are kind of righting the wrongs of the past. And it's, we talk about the billions that could have been saved from pension fund performance, looking in the rearview mirror, where there could have been a lot more money saved as if we actually paid our obligations along the way, rather than passing them off. And so, I commend the legislature in the kind of unanimous vote to continue these fiscal guardrails, to continue to pass sound budgets, and make sure that we're moving in the right direction long term.
And to that point, too, and when we were talking about baby bonds before, there was a lot of debate about how that was going to be funded, and there was a lot of holdup on that. And one of the ways that you were able to find to fund that was through that savings that in the investment funds, it's in particular the teachers fund, because there was a reserve fund that was available. Could you talk about a little bit how you were able to access that money to help fund the baby bond program?
Sure. So when baby bonds was passed back in 2021, so prior to me coming into the office, the legislation called for the program to be funded over a 12-year period by bonding $50 million a year to pay for the program. So it was going to be a $600 million program in total. There were concerns about borrowing to fund this trust over time. And so coming into the office, the governor and legislature and I were all committed to working together to look at other ways to fund the program, other ways to get there. And so in my office, we were bouncing around a host of different ways to finance the program. What we ended up doing, and in part because of the progress that we've made in terms of our fiscal health and our credit rating upgrades and having a full rainy day fund, there was a reserve fund that was put in place when the teachers' retirement fund was restructured back in 2019. And it was funded with surplus money from the 2019 budget cycle. And what we were able to do is we worked with a bond insurer, and we were able to get a surety for the money that was in that account, which allowed us to release that. It was about $380 million. We were able to release that and put it into the baby bond trust. What that allowed us to do, because we're investing that larger corpus up front, we were able to get the full benefit of and essentially meet that $600 million that we would have needed to borrow with that $380 million up front, without having to borrow, without paying any interest costs. So the overall program cost was reduced by $200 million, and we also saved with the interest and kind of transaction fees that we would have had if we were to borrow. And so that money is being invested now. It's already grown significantly. I believe we're at about 414 million in that trust at this point. And we'll invest that over the life of the program. And so, you know, it's incredible cost savings to taxpayers while still being able to meet the goal of funding the program.
Yeah, and you know, one area that doesn't get talked about a lot with the fiscal guardrails is the bond cap and that unfunded liability that we have just from the bonding that's out. Per capita, Connecticut's one of the highest bonded states, borrowing. And as a former member of the State Bond Commission, it's something I paid very close attention to in my time in the legislature as well. Senator McKinney, you know, what does that impact? You know, we have the pension fund liabilities that are out there, $60 billion, but we also have a large amount of bonded debt that's out there that needs to be paid.
Well, the bond cap has been instrumental in, again, resisting the urge when revenues aren't there to use your borrowing to pay for what would naturally be operating costs. And again, I don't like to be too critical of people, but during the Malloy years, we exploded our borrowing and bonding. We bonded to pay for jobs in the private sector. It really was, I think, a huge mistake. So again, the bonding cap has been an important part of making sure we don't go over a certain amount of borrowing. And that just comes down to political will. I mean, there's something called steep grants, which were developed to protect small towns so they could get borrowing that some of the larger cities would get through Urban Act grants. And every year there was, I don't know, $20, $30 million in steep grants, and I represented one large town and 4 small towns. And every year where we put a Republican budget together, I would zero out the steep grants. And, you know, they were paying for sidewalks, they were paying for other things, not unimportant, but not necessary when you're looking at all of the debt we were accruing. The budget would pass, the steep grants would be in there, and I would apply to get some for my towns. And people would be like, well, wait a minute, you're a hypocrite. You said we shouldn't be spending this money, but now you're asking for it. I said, the money's going to be spent, so of course I'm going to fight for my towns. So, you know, the bonding cap protects us from that urge, again, to say, let's do something, and later on somebody else is going to pay the bill. And again, that just goes back to the fact that here's my one partisan statement of the day. All of these really good fiscal guardrails and practices occurred because the legislature was tied in the Senate and very close in the House. When you have large majorities, and in Republican states you get large majorities of Republicans, in Connecticut you get large majority of Democrats, I don't think you get the best product. I think you get the best product when you have everybody in the room with a lot of different ideas, a lot of different needs coming from different communities, everybody kind of understanding everybody and working out the best result. And I think that's what we've seen. But, you know, you mentioned the CBIA deal that's coming up in 2027. Guess what's happening before the CBIA deal? There's an election in 2026. Will Governor Lamont try to sit down with state employees to maybe renegotiate that before the election? I don't know. I would advise him to take a look at it. I'm not sure the state employees are going to want to do that. But my message to all of you as that comes is don't blame the unions. Don't blame the negotiators for whatever they do. We just learned that the 2017 deal saved $5.4 billion roughly. Comptroller Scanlon said, but that was $500 million less than they promised. No surprise. We never thought it was going to get everything that they said. You need to talk to your legislators about it. And it wasn't, again, until the bipartisan reforms that we actually voted on union contracts. Many people don't know that we never voted on them in the legislature. If you didn't vote, they were deemed approved. So we never voted. Now there's a commitment to vote on everything, and legislators need to be held accountable for that vote. I mean, if you all had an employee or employees who came into your office and demanded higher wages, better benefits, and health care, and you gave it to them, and you turned around in a couple years and said, boy, you know, we're in the red here, what'd we do? Are you going to blame your employees or are you going to blame yourself? Because you ought to be blaming yourself. And so I don't blame the union negotiators for asking for the sun, the moon, and the stars. I don't blame the employees for wanting it. I blame the people over the years who've given it to them. And that's a message that we all need to send to whoever the governor is in 2027 and the legislators, that, you know, there are certain things here that we need to be careful about. And my biggest example over the years has been the Yukon Health Center. For years, I fought Governor Rell, who was a friend of mine and in my party. I fought Governor Malloy on building the new hospital in Farmington. One, why would you build in Farmington when you should have built in Hartford? Two, why is the state building an ambulatory center to compete against Hartford Hospital, St. Francis Hospital, Bristol, and all of the other hospitals that we have around us who had beds, who had needs, who were struggling? And now you see that every year that runs a deficit in the tens of millions of dollars. And they will tell you it's not because we don't run a hospital as well as they run it at Hartford Hospital. It's because our employee costs and benefits and pension costs are that much higher. Well, then why are we doing that? Why are we doing that? And the argument from Yukon, obviously they wanted everything. They wanted bigger, they wanted newer, was, well, we have a medical school and we're going to lose the medical school if we don't have a hospital. And my argument was, hello, Harvard Medical School doesn't have a hospital. How is it the best medical school maybe in the world? Because they work with Mass General and all the other great hospitals. We have great hospitals here. So I think that's something that's got to be addressed. I know the governor's talked about trying to find a solution, but you're never going to find a private buyer for that hospital if they have to take the employees on under the current state employee salary and benefit structure. So that's got to be resolved, if not now, by the next CBIA deal.
So we have a lot of things coming up over the next few years. Election here in November for the legislature, election for statewide offices, including yourself, Treasurer Russell, in 2026, the CBIA agreement in 2027.
Wait a minute, it's only 2024. Don't talk about the election yet.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I didn't want to make any announcement.
Come on.
But, looking at those things going ahead, we only have a couple more minutes, but just touch upon the importance of keeping those fiscal guardrails where they are. I know it's a very big priority for CBIA and for our business community to make sure that we have that sustainability and predictability going into the future. And as one of the authors of those fiscal guardrails, I take it very personally. But looking at it and seeing like some conversations about maybe changing how things are formulated or maybe trying to go around them as much as possible. Let's just touch upon the importance of keeping those in place.
I think it's absolutely on the table. I mean, I talked to some of my former colleagues who are still in the legislature, and they are having discussions about the numbers related to the volatility cap, about other ways where they can free up to spend more money. And I would just urge all of you to continue to support the guardrails and to continue to stay the course of where we've been. The governor's right. They passed a very good budget. They understood, I think really smartly, that things were not going to be as great with our numbers coming in. They weren't. And yet, unlike so many other states, when the COVID money ran out, we still have a budget surplus. Our budget is balanced, and a lot of other states aren't. If that's not a success story, I don't know what is. And why would you want to mess with success?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think that the reforms that have been put in place have obviously been very successful. I think there is always going to be this need to balance kind of our overall fiscal health and long-term future and addressing a lot of the wrongs of the past with making investments in people and addressing needs now. And I think one of the things that's positive is we are now in the position as a state where we are operating from a position of strength rather than jumping from crisis to crisis and trying to manage that, right? I mean, you talked about the bond cap and bonding under Malloy. I mean, you also have to keep in mind when Malloy took office, the condition that the state was in, right? We didn't have a rainy day fund. We didn't have balanced budgets. We had huge fixed costs. A lot of these reforms and things that we've done to make long-term changes have freed us up to be in a much better position as a state and to be making these positions from that position of strength rather than from crises.
Well, I want to thank you both for being here today and a robust discussion about the state fiscal health. So thank you guys for being here. We're going to take a 15-minute break. And if you have the chance, take the survey. It's in your program book. You scan the QR code, but we're going to be back here in the main room at 10:15. Thank you, guys.
All right, we're gonna shift gears to the economic forecast. Hope you all enjoyed that conversation with Chris and the panel on some real big issues. Before I introduce Ezra, I wanted to call everyone's attention to the back of the program. We are having the first ever, thinking of hopefully warmer days ahead of us, the first ever CBIA golf tournament to raise money for the foundation on June 24th. So if you play golf, come out. If you don't play golf, come out. It will be a fun time regardless, and that's on the back of your program. So put that date on your calendar right now before you leave, and we'll hope to see all 450 of you there. So it's my pleasure, as I mentioned at the opening, to introduce kind of a fan favorite at this event, Ezra Greenberg, who is a partner at McKinney & Company's strategy and corporate finance practice in engineering and construction and building materials.